This week's project is a birch crotch piece, and if you've watched my videos before, you'll know that I love crotch pieces. This is birch, and stay tuned because besides the bowl, you'll get to see a second project out of the second half of the same piece. For those that have watched my channel, you'll know that I'm a fan of crotch pieces, and I have a nice piece of birch here. I've cut it in half. Now this piece is pretty thin. I might do something with it. Again, it does have a nice crotch marking through it. It could be a small plate. This is going to be a bowl. So this will be the top. You can see again the crotch here. Some nice grain pattern to it. Obviously a branch coming out here. There was also a branch here, over here, so there's some grain pattern here. But I'll try and maximize the diameter that I can get out of this, and this will make a nice bowl. This is wet wood. It's 35-40% moisture right now, so I'm going to rough turn it and then put it in my kiln for a couple weeks, and then I'll finish it after that. I misspoke earlier when I said this wood was 30% moisture. It's probably closer to 50. It was throwing water just as it was spinning. But one of the advantages of cutting wet wood is you can see the shavings coming off on my arm. Those shavings are about 2 inches long. Wet wood cuts very, very easily. Doesn't sand well, but cuts very, very easily. The other thing you'll notice here is I am wearing a face shield. I always wear eye protection, usually just eyeglasses. But in this case, because I was removing bark, there were larger pieces coming off, so I did put my face shield on. I know I've said this before, but I often say that I put a piece of wood on the lathe and I let the wood speak to me as far as what the shape is going to be. That's not exactly the case in this situation. You can see here that as I made it round, which would have been a more traditional bowl shape, I still had this piece of bark that I had to remove. So I ended up going with a much steeper side. So it's not necessarily a traditional bowl shape. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Sometimes it's nice to do something that's a little different. Now I'm hollowing out the inside of the bowl. I have it flipped around on the tenon that I made. And you can see I'm pushing my carbide cutter straight in, following the profile on the outside of the bowl. I did contemplate coring this, not that I would be able to do anything with the core that I removed. Coring just refers to the fact that you can just cut straight in, make one cut rather than hollowing everything out, and then remove that inner piece and then use that to turn a second bowl out of, for example. In this case, it would have been too small. I wouldn't have done anything with it anyways, but I was more or less just practicing that skill set. So now we have a bowl that is very wet, uniformly thick. It's about 1 inch thick, which is rule of thumb. You want to go 10% of the diameter in rim thickness. So that's 1 inch, and the bowl is just a little over 10 inches. So that's good. It's uniform right to the bottom. I'm going to put a little end seal on the end grain, and we'll put that in the kiln, and that'll dry for a couple weeks. And out of that same piece, the other half, which was smaller, we're going to get a plate. And it's also going to be 10 inches in diameter. It's got a nice crotch grain in it here, but it's very thin, only 1.5 inches thick, probably 2 inches at the most. And make a nice little plate to go with that bowl. So it's been a little over a week, and this bowl has come out of my kiln. And it's about 10 to 15% moisture, so that's plenty dry enough to finish turning. But it has gone out around, you can see that here. So what I'm doing in this shot is I'm just squaring my tenon up because I want to mount this in my chuck. So if I try to mount it with the tenon not square, then it will be very dependent upon where it is in the chuck. And if I were to move it and try and remount it, it wouldn't mount in the same place. So you always want to true up your tenon that you've turned. So that's all I'm doing here is just truing it up and putting a nice dovetail on it. Now I've got it flipped around in that, using that tenon in my chuck, and then just straightening the walls up. Again, taking that out of roundness out of it. It's cutting very well. It is dry. You can see the shavings are smaller than they were before, but it's still cutting very, very well and very easily. You can see that bark inclusion there. At first I thought I was going to save it, but as it dried up, it shrunk out. It shrunk up too much, and it just was not possible to save it. Because it's over an inch thick, I do have the ability to change the shape of the bowl slightly. So I'm rounding it up a little bit more so it's not quite so square tapered looking, making it look a little bit more like a traditional bowl. Now that the outside's done, I'm just using my carbide cutter, again cutting very well. The shavings coming off are huge, so it is cutting well. And I'm just plunging straight in and establishing that wall thickness. Once I get it thickness established up near the rim, I will switch to my bowl gouge, which again is always my go-to. Had a little bit of a catch right there. You saw that. Didn't do any damage. That was my fault. Operator inattention. Just presented the tool at the wrong angle. But it didn't do any damage. You can see here that bark inclusion actually broke out. So at this point, I am committed to taking the rest of it out, and we'll fill that with epoxy. So before I do that, I want to get to the final thickness. No need of pouring the epoxy any thicker than I need and then just cutting it back. I may as well get it very close to my final thickness and then pour the epoxy. Epoxy is typically very expensive, so you want to minimize the amount you're going to use. Looking back earlier, that catch that I had may have actually been what caused that bark inclusion to chip out. Again, it's not that much of a concern. I wouldn't have been able to save it. Even if I didn't have that catch, it was falling out anyways. So I mixed up my resin. The customer had required a dark blue. You can see I just formed it up with tuck tape. Made sure I mixed the resin well, mixed it for about 5 minutes, added the mica powder, dark blue, and then poured it into the form that I made with tuck tape. Here you can see the epoxy after I removed the tuck tape that I formed it up with. Full disclosure, I did end up doing this twice, pouring the epoxy. First time it leaked on me. I should have known better. Whenever I form up epoxy, I should always use hot melt glue around the outer limit of where the epoxy is going to be poured. It just makes for a stronger bond than the tuck tape alone. I think tuck tape would be fine, except epoxy generates a bit of heat, and I think that causes the tuck tape to fail. So by putting the hot melt glue there, that can withstand the higher temperatures, and I didn't have a leak the second time. Once it hardened up, I went ahead and mounted it back in the lathe, and then just trimmed it down so that it was flush and smooth. I switched to the inside of the bowl, and in this video you're probably seeing more carbide use than I normally would. typically with the epoxy, the carbide does a really good job at cutting the epoxy without causing it to chip out. The other thing that I've done here is I have a tool rest that's curved that follows the profile of a bowl, especially on the inside, much better. So I use it when I want to get close to the surface of the bowl. If you are going to have a catch or any chip out, tear out on the inside of a bowl, it's usually because the tool has gotten too far away from the surface. So the curved tool rest just allows me to maintain a much smaller distance between the end of the tool and the inside of the bowl. Now I'm beginning the sanding process. So here in the beginning, I'm just using a bit of sheet paper just to sand the inside of the bowl. And again, I'm not going to show the whole process, but just the beginning. And it's fairly smooth, but I did start with 80 grit. After that first sanding, I like to do an inspection and just see if there's any spots that I missed earlier. And there was a little bit of tear out, especially down the bottom here, a little bit more than what I could sand. So I'm going to sharpen up my gouge. It was already sharp, but sometimes when I've got a bit of tear out, I'll take this diamond file and just run over it very lightly to put a real sharp edge on my gouge before going in and trying to clean up that tear out right there at the bottom. So typically I try to avoid this, sanding first, then going back again with the tool and sanding again. It just creates a lot of unnecessary rework. But in this case, and sometimes I don't see that tear out or feel it until that first time that I've sanded. Now that that's complete, I'm ready to apply a sanding sealer. I believe I sanded it up to 180 grit here before applying the sanding sealer. That just helps raise the grain a bit. Also, as the name implies, just to seal the wood up a bit. And then I'll go back and finish the sanding once this is dried. When I split this crotch piece in half, I was able to get two pieces, one deep enough for a bowl, the other one, which was a bit thinner, was deep enough for a plate. I made a mistake here. I didn't hit the record button. So this is the complementary plate that's going with that bowl. It also had epoxy on it. I've done the shaping of the inside roughly, completely shaped the outside. It's good, ready for sanding. The epoxy is all cleaned up. Unfortunately, I didn't record any of it. You'll have to take my word for it. The outside is basically finished. I'm ready to start sanding it. And I haven't done anything yet on the inside other than clean up the epoxy. So the the plate is still too thick. So I'll go now to the inside. Now that the outside is finished, I'll go to the inside and cut it down to its final thickness. This wood is dry, but it's cutting very well. You can see that from the shavings coming off onto my arm and sleeve. Shavings are a good size. It's a good mix of very fine shavings and a bit larger shavings. At this point, you want to start seeing some fine shavings because I'm making a finish cut here. I want to be able to start sanding right away after I finish this cut. This is not the type of cut that I would do to hollow out the inside of a bowl where I'm removing a lot of material very, very quickly. I want this to be a fine cut, leaving me with a surface that's ready to start sanding. The closer I get to the final thickness, the more frequently I want to stop and just check the thickness. And I can do this with my fingers and also with the thickness gouge that the thickness gauge that I have. Now I'm switching to my negative rake scraper. You've seen me on my channel a lot use this. And again, you can see the shavings are very, very fine coming off of my hand. This is a finish cut, so this is what you want. Now the inside is ready to sand. The thickness is uniform all the way down. I'll start with a sheet to sand it, and then I'll switch to my power sander on the disc. And you can see here as I pass my thickness gauge down that it's fairly uniform. And here's the finished product, a bowl and a matching plate. I think it turned out very well. I'm pleased with the color and grain pattern to this crotch piece, and the epoxy is a nice complement to the overall bowl. Again, you can see the beautiful grain pattern and all the extra features due to the crotch and the additional branches coming off of it. You can see here 2 crotch pieces coming out of the bowl, and makes for a very beautiful feature. Here's the complementary plate. I think it turned out very well. But if you look at this, you'll see that it, being birch, doesn't have a lot of figure, grain, or color to it other than the feathering from the crotch piece running down the middle. Otherwise, it's fairly nondescript. But I think it does make a nice complement for the bowl, as well as the epoxy that's included where the bark inclusion was. This piece also has some epoxy in it, again because of the bark inclusion that came out. I could have kept it in the plate, but I actually took it out intentionally just so that the plate would have a splash of color and epoxy as well as the bowl.